Hello and welcome to DTV. I'm Michael Davis and I'll be your host for today's segment of DTV about the Knox County government, its form and function, and some of the politics that are involved in it all. Today, for our expert guest panel, we have with us Mr. Mark Harmon, former Knox County Commissioner from District 2, State Democratic Executive Committee member, and current columnist for the Knoxville News Sentinel, and also author of the book Crashing the Commission. Also, we have with us Bill Lyons, past professor of political science at the University of Tennessee and author of Government and Politics in Tennessee and Other Texts, and currently deputy to the city mayor. And also we have Billy Stair, former director of communications and community outreach at Oak Ridge National Labs, and former senior policy advisor to Governor Ned McWhirter, and also an author of Government and Politics in Tennessee. Gentlemen, welcome to DTV, and thank you so much for being here. Okay, so very briefly, can we have a general overview, just the bare bones, of Knox County government?
Well, I'll start, and then I think we all have plenty to add.
Sure.
I mean, basically, the county government is an extension of the state government in many ways, and a lot of its functions are outlined in the Constitution. But like most others, it's got an executive branch led by the county mayor. It's got a judicial election of many judicial officers and judges at county elections. They're not held as often, and it's got a legislative branch, the county commission, and that's changed in form somewhat recently, reduced in size. It now has 2 at-large and 9 district representatives. And I didn't mention the fee offices of the sheriff. I thought I'd leave some.
Well, yes.
With plenty more.
Plenty more. Yes, we have fee offices such as a sheriff or a trustee, and we have sort of such an old system that they actually have to sue each year for their own budgets. So that's something that could be corrected, perhaps. The county commission, I would add that its major budget function is schools. But if you look at its major duties, the day-to-day stuff at most meetings has to do with land use. And so it's an interesting thing. It's also elected on a partisan basis, unlike, say, the school board or the city council. And although D and R behind your name explains a lot about whether you get elected in your district, it doesn't very well predict which way you're going to go on any one particular issue.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's true that in most county offices, and I have to think a while to get an exception other than perhaps county commission, there are no real ideological differences between candidates or the people who operate the offices. For example, if you ran for the state legislature, whether or not you would give public funds to private schools or expand Medicaid are very serious ideological differences. But within the trustee's office or the county clerk's office, when people run, there essentially is no ideological difference. They all promise to be more efficient and be more customer friendly, and it's often as much like running for student body president in high school as something else.
But there are distinctions. There are distinctions like those who are more inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to developers and those who are not. Those who are more inclined to challenge the sheriff and those who are not. So there are subtleties of differences, but they're not drawn along partisan lines typically.
Okay. Do you see those differences as being or which offices? We mentioned the fee offices, and we've also mentioned county commission offices. Do the partisan issues play in heavier in one versus the other?
Well, I think definitely not in the fee offices. Those are largely ministerial. They're set up. They're really holdovers from the original Constitution. For instance, the Register of Deeds is pretty hard to make that partisan in any way, or ideological. Property assessor. Yeah, they're doing the some basic functions that you want to assure some independence, and that really you have to have in order for any society to function. Who owns the land? Let's keep a record of that. Let's keep track of the money. Thence in trustee. And the other offices, that we've mentioned, not so much. Sheriff, I mean, could be. Obviously, there are ways of looking at law enforcement that take on all sorts of potential ideological and reflect national differences. Yes. For instance, the whole immigration enforcement, that sort of thing. So that definitely could be a factor.
Definitely a big issue in Knox County right now with the 287G program.
Exactly, and issues like that. County executive, to some degree, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that the county executive, unlike, say, a strong city mayor in that system, doesn't control the majority of the budget because you have an independent elected school board that makes specific decisions about the schools, though the larger function, the county commission, you know, the category they do, or the day-to-day operations of the sheriff's department, they're independently elected. The sheriff's independently elected. So, whereas the city mayor, everybody reports to the city mayor. And
Right.
so that's a very different style and function.
There's a different set of relationships. There's some offices, for example, the school board is probably the best one. Virtually everyone at some point in their life touches the school board either through their children or themselves or their parents. There are other offices, though, that have changed dramatically over time. You mentioned the Register of Deeds. There was, in the 19th century, that might have been the most important office in the courthouse when all land was recorded and managed manually. But now that it's all computerized, it's a relatively small set of people, attorneys primarily, that deal with the Register of Deeds. The same as your license plate. That used to be someone that you would touch once a year going to the office and standing in line, and you would have the sense of their office, but now it's online and you literally never see them or touch them. So those things have evolved over time.
And they're important still. I mean, take the county clerk, for example. There was a rather embarrassing incident when he forgot to collect the hotel tax. And now he got around to doing it. But in the meantime, it was a rather black eye for that particular office. And we've had problems with trustees. One has gone to jail, one had to quit and reach a court settlement.
Right.
So they're very important offices nonetheless.
Yeah, I was going to say probably earlier that you encounter them more often now when they mess up as opposed to the actual daily delivery of their services.
Yes.
And part of the reason I think that you get that they're unique and sometimes people, as Billy says, mess up is when people are choosing the folks running, it's pretty hard, I think, if you find for people to really know exactly why they're voting for somebody for what. Your city council model fulfills that. Because it's really a big burden to put on the electorate to really understand the function of the county clerk, the register of deed, the trustee. I mean, that's usually a very small number of people deal extensively with those folks, and the general public not so much.
Okay, so that brings us up to a very good point there. What are some of these fee offices? What do they do? What would be the Cliff Note version of some of these offices? And for people that would be interested in seeking those offices or just voting for those offices,
I'll do
really
one, and then we can
Sure.
Pass
do
them
the
around,
others.
remember them
Sure.
all.
The trustee's office is one which I think has emerged as one of the most important, probably always has been in some respects. The trustee collects taxes, and then I believe Mark allocates those taxes to the other agencies. And an aspect that most people don't think about, I believe the trustee also invests some of the money that resides in the account, and a wise investment obviously generates more money than would have been there otherwise. So I think the trustee, and given that we've, as you mentioned, Mark, had some issues in the trustee's office, that in some respects is one of the very most important local offices we have.
Right. And I'll mention the property assessor. That's a very important office. We have a situation where governments cannot gain by the inflation in property values. You can't gain by reappraising property. When the properties are appraised, the overall rate is reduced such that it's neutral for the city and for the county. So the property assessor is really not it has to be independent. It's not under any pressure to come up with higher assessments or appraisals, but makes a lot of very important decisions about what individual homes are worth and businesses for tax purposes. And there is a lot of appeal and a lot of response as part of their job when people are unhappy. And
It's a controversial job.
Right. It's a very key job, and people, I hope, pay a lot of attention to that. Usually people with some experience in the real estate world, not always, are those that are selected for those jobs.
Right.
And it should be a good high-tech job. Sometimes it isn't done that way, but it should be. I would add the county clerk, of course. We interact with the county clerk whenever we, say, get new tags for our vehicles and update that, or registrations, or our driver's licenses. We mentioned the hotel tax. It's an important position. You can screw up on that. County clerk also is responsible for finding someone to keep track of meetings, records of meetings. And so that's the person who is there, taking formal record of county commission and other things. So these are important tasks. You need people who can prove they handle them, but they are also term limited. You know, two elected 4-year terms.
Okay.
There's a different category of county office that's probably worth discussing, and that's the sheriff.
Right.
The sheriff, I believe, apart from the school system, has more employees than any other.
Oh, more than 1,000.
Yeah, more than any other office in county government. And most of us never encounter the sheriff's office unless perhaps we have a traffic accident, which then is quite important. But there's a significance in that in many counties, and I think Knox County would probably be an example, the sheriff can be a very important political stakeholder in his or her relationship to other members of county government.
Right.
And so there is a stake in the election of a sheriff that goes beyond just the management of the sheriff's office.
Right. And local government being what it is, when you are able to hire a whole lot of people, say in the other fee offices, a lot of it is the hiring and they have some independence there. The sheriff, as you say, with all the people that you have, including a lot of people don't realize that's a constitutionally mandated office.
Right.
So
as opposed to the chief of police in a city.
So, and that's why even in Nashville with metro government, they still have to have a sheriff. The sheriff there runs the jail, but the chief of police in Nashville handles
law
police.
enforcement.
Right.
And we should also note that the sheriffs are very powerful statewide.
Exactly.
They were able to get away with create something called a post commission, which passes on whether persons can be candidates for sheriff.
Yes.
And whether they have a sufficient law enforcement background. And while it seemed like a good idea, it also presents the potential for abuse, where an incumbent can try to seek to disqualify a challenger. And we have seen that.
Okay. Right. And what is the history of this being an elected position in Tennessee as opposed
the
to
sheriff,
an appointed?
From the beginning.
The sheriff has always been, I mean, going all the way back to England, someone who has the power to take away your freedom is always subject to public recall. I mean, that's a very intrinsic principle in American democracy. Today, to vector off just a little bit, any person running for statewide office, for governor or senator, I guarantee you will try to contact the sheriffs in almost every county. They are absolutely critical to a statewide political campaign.
And in Knox County, we have a county commission, of course, that provides legislative branch of the government. Do they have it? What is their influence on the sheriff, or the executive branch's influence on the sheriff? Are there particular limits there? Is there any other interplay that provides limitation to the sheriff's authority?
They're all looking at me because when I was on commission, at the start there was a very strong division between those who generally deferred to the county mayor and those who generally deferred to the sheriff. It was so bad that when I joined county commission, there was an orientation session held by the mayor and a different one held by the sheriff.
Really?
Okay. So
it does kind of speak to some divide there.
Right, it does. And I think there's a lot of deference to the sheriff, sometimes too much. I challenged a number of things. Generally, now the sheriff argues that his budget cannot be reduced. I'm not sure that's the right way to read the state law, but certainly the commissioners are not going to challenge that, and usually they give him significant increases in his budget. I personally think that a sheriff's department exceeding 1,000 people might be overstaffed, and I think there's about somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 positions that we could eliminate by attrition. But I would lose those votes 18-1, 17-2. So it is a very powerful position. And it's politically important. When you have more than 1,000 employees, that's a political voting bloc as well. I should also mention, because we passed over this rather quickly, when county commission and the school board, county commission can only give the school board a pot of money. They can't dictate how to spend it. As a matter of fact, if they start venturing in that direction, they're in violation of at least one and probably several court orders.
And that's a very interesting thing. I want to touch back on some of that sheriff issue in just a second, but with the school board not being able to, in effect, set its budget, is only in control of how it's appropriated, how it's effectuated. Is that set up as a check and balance, or is this just a kind of a happenstance thing?
That policy is different in various states. For example, in some states, school boards are authorized actually to raise revenues. They have taxing authority. That has never been the case in Tennessee, and you can make a compelling argument on both sides of that. But like Mark says, they are allocated a pot of money from county commission, and they can decide how much goes to capital or how much goes to salaries or how much goes to other things.
Right.
Although, I need to be careful, in salaries, there's a state requirement that they can't just cut salaries 50% or allocate it all to principals or whatever. There's a state guideline they have to follow.
And we'd be, remiss if we didn't mention, even though formally those decisions, the school board makes the policy decisions, chooses the director of schools, and commonly called a superintendent, and the overall budget is, and that's all theoretically set by commission. Mayor Burchett took a very active role in advocating for a school to be built in one area of Knox County, even though that wasn't actually officially in the lineup of duties, but it's real. It makes a difference, and that it made a difference in that outcome. So those sorts of things happen. Both the sheriff is powerful in county politics, and the lines that are drawn in the county executive has certain limits, but the lines that are drawn are sometimes a little more dotted, and that's the way it is in all levels of government.
Right. Yes. Okay. All right. Circling back to the sheriff there, can we get an idea of what the actual size of that budget is? I think that's always a good measure of where some of these different positions have their power and what kind of budget they control over. Or just in terms of relation, how big is it related to other budgets within the county?
Well, let's see. Our county budget is just shy of $1 billion. We are sitting around, I think it's around 890 million. Is it something in that neighborhood? And roughly 60% of it is schools, maybe 30% of it is sheriff, and the rest is everything else. I think that's a good approximation of where the budget is.
He operates a large jail. I mean, it's not Mayberry. I mean, it's a big, hundreds of people in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got, you said, about 27, roughly 30%.
I'm roughing it out
on the sheriff, and then the 60% for school boards, or the school itself, and that's. So, what are some of the decision-making powers that any other elected county officials have in that remainder of the slot there?
Well, you got, the county departments under the purview of the county mayor, of course. They have a parks department, parks and recreation department. Their road decisions have to be. They have public works. They have public health, and those. There are, and libraries. Those aren't the big ticket, big budget items that the others are.
Throw in senior centers. There's a bunch of things that are on that occupy a significant but not huge part of the budget. And there's also, as Bill mentioned, lots of departments that deal with everything from county vehicles to stormwater to property assessors' appeals, the Metropolitan Planning Commission, which has a big role in land use. So all of those are out there as well, important.
Right. So it's safe to say that no matter what the elected position is, and some more than others, there's going to be some direct influence on people's lives and on residents of Knox County.
There's no question about it, and to an extent that's not obvious to most people. There are interpersonal relationships among the departments in the sense that one elected official might or might not support another one based on political alliances and ambitions and egos and so forth. So.
Yeah, you never think about codes enforcement until your neighbor is grilling a pig on an open spit in front of your yard, and the smell is drifting into your house, and this happens, 2-3 times a week. Then you begin to learn about codes enforcement.
Right.
Right, and people's property, if an abandoned house next to them, weeds growing, those are really major functions of government, local government at all levels, and people expect to be able to have a voice at the other end of the line that is responsive to that.
Yeah. And other systemic things like the salaries for teachers, salaries for other, for our sheriff's deputies and other important county functions.
And let's not leave out setting the tax rate. Yes. I mean, there was a push not that many years ago by many to have the county property tax increase significantly for education, and that didn't prevail in that discussion. But you know, that's of course you'll hear people running, and whether or not what the scope of the size of government is and how much money goes to various functions sort of depend on the overall pie, which is the property tax,
Right.
for the most part.
Sales taxes a little bit, but mostly property tax.
Yeah. So with taxes going into so many things that are used by both county residents and city residents, oftentimes sets a stage for a lot of contention. What are some of the politics that play into the city versus the county residents, or the county government versus the city government in a area that's urbanized like Knox County?
Well, as presently working in city government, we always like to point out that we're also in the county, and we also pay county taxes.
Right.
and so there is a sort of a conventional wisdom or narrative out there when people say the county, they mean outside the city, rather than including the city. And Mark, as a county commissioner, represented the city area.
An entirely, well, for 1.5 block, but entirely within the city limits district. And it was very frustrating one time because the then chairman, Scott Moore, would say, well, how many of those in the city, how many in the county? And at one point, Sam McKenzie said, well, wouldn't by definition all of them be in the county?
Well, you would be right.
Well, I can tell you one tension we do not have, and which I think it's a good feature of Knox County. There's only one school system in Knox County. And if you
wasn't always that way.
That's right. I guess it was the late 80s when they merged. But Blount County has Maryville and Alcoa in the county, and Oak Ridge has Anderson and Oak Ridge.
And Shelby County has God knows how many now. I mean,
well, that's right, for other kinds of reasons. But there's a constant tension in counties between the division of the sales tax and property tax revenues to school systems that fortunately Knox County does not have to deal with. And so you should have a word of thanks to people about 30 years ago who had the ability to chop their way through that problem.
And Mark mentioned the Metropolitan Planning Commission, MPC. We both pay for that. That serves both units, and both put money into it. And really, there's not that much day-to-day or overt argumentation or tension about those. Those are pretty. Those distribution of funds come up sometimes, but not all that much.
I'm not sure what everyone's policy was, but when I was a commissioner, and there was something that really was city council's business, I didn't say to the person, "Well, take that to your city councilman." I said, "All right, I will look into it. I will also call your city councilman, and the two of us will double team the appropriate agency." I think there's a lot of that level of cooperation. I got along perfectly with the city council members I had to deal with.
Right. We often get calls and say, "Well, that's actually a county function." Many people are. I live in Knoxville. I mean, it's amazing. You don't want to take for granted that
picking up
the average person understands what function is performed by what unit. That's not universally understood.
And I would mention the thing that you said about the automatic reduction of the property tax rate, so no one gets a tax increase from the fact that your home went up in value with general inflation. That seems like a good thing, but in the long run, you got to wonder about the sustainability of it, because schools don't get a break on their costs for inflation. Teachers' salaries don't get a break. So it really does strain budgets because you have costs that are affected by inflation, but a tax base that is held steady to inflation.
Right. So you have to actually raise taxes. Well, we at the city have, we're in the same function, property tax in either unit. You can't gain from inflation, but so you up whenever we lower the rate, even though then it might be raised, but the actual rate now in both units is probably the lowest it's been in quite a while, even though the actual dollars people pay because of their home being worth more may be the same. It's confusing to a lot of people, but it's
and there's a subtle pressure too.
Yes.
The subtle pressure is to bring more things onto the tax rolls, which in some cases means some pretty ugly sprawl. We are one of the top 10 sprawl zones in the country, and we got to ask ourselves, is that good?
Right. Well, you've got to grow. We in the city are committed to growing through redevelopment because we don't have any land to grow into. But there's still room, for spreading out once you get into suburban areas, and that brings up a lot of questions and tax pressure. Because then you have to build new schools out there as well, and that's expensive.
Speaking of understanding about some of these county offices, one of the things that we'd like to accomplish this is just letting everyone know about all these different offices and how they could seek these offices or at least know more about them when they go to the polls. What are some things that contribute to people's misunderstanding of these offices, and what do you think we should tell our audience, who hopefully is fairly educated about these things, but encounter other people that they might want to let know about some of these county offices, how to seek election, how it affects people's lives? What would you like to say to our audience in order to get that message across?
Well, one thing is you have to have a realistic sense of what it costs to run for office. There was a time not very long ago when you could run for some of these offices for probably $3,000 or $4,000. It was basically some yard signs you put up and a few palm cards. But now, and Mark, I defer to you guys, if you want to ante up to run for trustee or run for county clerk, it's probably $100,000
Countywide, it might be, yes.
to put on the table.
Yeah. For a district office, maybe you can get away with $20,000.
Yeah.
I won spending around $6,000, but that was a long time ago in a very special environment related to term limit controversies.
Right.
Right. I think if people would know what a campaign is about, understand that you can get a list of voters, and that would be your basis of contacting people. You have to reach out to them in all the various ways you can, obviously to study and understand what office you're running for, and to obviously be aware of what people's concerns are as well.
Now, I want to be careful not to leave the misunderstanding. If you ran for a county commission seat, it would not necessarily take $100,000. If you had a core of volunteers who were genuinely willing to knock on doors and make phone calls and such, and you were an attractive candidate, then it's different.
Really depends on the office.
And let's not even indirectly dissuade anyone from running.
Right.
Our democracy, our county, our city are enhanced when people bring new ideas and fresh faces into the process. But if you're considering doing it, know how to campaign, and also learn a little bit more about the office. You can go to websites, you can read your book, you can look at all the stuff online from the various things about what the job is. Read news stories about what's been going on with it. You can organize yourself, probably mostly in your own den reading, and understand what these are about.
And attend a couple, it's amazing, attend some meetings.
Yeah.
Come to City Council, County Commission, Metropolitan Planning Commission, whatever you would seek. Of course, and those are appointments. But even so, understand the whole system by going and observing. That's real helpful too.
And just briefly, before we wrap up, any comments on about why people should be concerned about county offices and actually go to the polls in the first place?
Well, it's the government closest to you every day. I mean, that's the big sexy issues, maybe national ones, that ones that people get very passionate about. A lot of them aren't dealt with locally, certain foreign policies not. But with your day-to-day lives, especially on the land use front, I'm glad you mentioned that. That is really that touches people very directly in the nature of their community.
More so than they even realize. They don't realize why there's a gas station now down on the road in front of their subdivision.
Plus, it's a training ground for people to move up to higher office. That's important too.
Very good point. All right, I think we'll call it right there. Thanks so much for watching DTV. Here with us about this segment on Knox County government. And Mark Harmon, Bill Lyons, and Billy Stair, thank you so much for being here with us today for a great discussion.
Michael, it was a pleasure.
Hey, Michael, thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And we hope that you come back and see us next time on DTV.